Hi guys, welcome to this video. It's the first in a series on modeling, texturing an object within 3ds Max as part of your 3D environment modeling module. I'm going to basically take you through the whole process, creating a model, looking at the tools you would use to create your assets, having a look at modifiers, then looking at the UV tools. To create the UV coordinates for our objects, exporting into Photoshop, creating some simple textures, and then bringing those back in to apply to our object. So we're going to use the arcade machine as an example. I know we did it in class, but I figured it would probably make sense to have some video resources that you can kind of refer to in terms of having refreshing yourselves on how the tools work and how the process works. So I've got 3ds Max opened. First thing that I want to do is look at my scale. It's very important that we model with scale considered in terms of real life scale, or even if you've got some kind of internal scale system within your game idea. The games engines that we're going to be using use a metric system, so everything in Unreal and Unity uses centimeters. So we want to make sure that our scene is set up accordingly for that as well. So with that in mind, I'm going to go to customize and go to unit setup. I think mine's already set up, but just to kind of show you the process, we can go into the system unit setup, and the important one is to make sure that this is set to centimeters. So press OK for that, and then your display unit scale, depending on what you're modeling, you might want to change the scale to match kind of what it is that you're looking at. So at the minute, I want to use centimeters because I'm modeling something quite small. If you're modeling a building or something that's quite large, you might want to use meters. So I'm going to use centimeters, just going to press OK. So when I look down at my units down here, I'm working in centimeters. So the first thing I want to do is to create an object to basically work from. So with that in mind, I'm just going to go to open a new tab. Let's have a look at our reference material, so arcade machine. Let's have a look at an image. So if we pick a decent one, I think we used this one in class. So I'm just going to open this in a new tab. So open image in new tab. There we go. I'm just going to keep this opened to one side. So let's just use 3ds. And we'll have this. Ooh, I'll have this a bit smaller. There we go. Just so that we can see it whilst we're working. So maybe a touch smaller. There we go. That'll do. Okay, so I'm just going to make this column a bit small as well, so I've got a bit more space to work in here. So just a reminder about the user interface. Obviously we've got our viewport. To navigate, we hold down our Alt and middle mouse button to orbit round. Just the middle mouse button by itself to pan, and then your scroll wheel to zoom in and out. If you find that you are away from the center of your scene, if you've got no objects, just press Z, that will zoom you back to the middle. And once you've got some objects, you can select one of those and press Z to reset your center as well. We have our outliner, our scene explorer on the left hand side. This will show us all of the objects we have in our scene once we start adding things. We've got our ribbon along the top here, which we will use extensively once we get into modeling. And then we've got our command panel down this side, which we'll also be using extensively once we kind of get the ball rolling. So your command panel has a tab for creating new objects, modifying new objects. The hierarchy tab for basically manipulating things like your pivot and manipulator, stuff like that. The motion tab, which we're not going to be looking at for this because we're not doing any animation. Display tabs, which might be useful for hiding specific objects or freezing objects, etc. And then our utilities, which we may use in future, but not now. So we're going to start by creating an object, and we've got our arcade machine here. I'm just going to start by creating a box because that's going to approximate the shape of this the most. So don't worry about where you firstly create the object. We're just going to kind of get it roughly in position first. And I've got this sort of slightly off center. We want to try and model to the center of our scene where possible. So my transform typing's down the bottom here. I'm just going to right click on each of these little arrows just to reset it back to the middle. One thing to keep in mind whilst we're modeling is that 3ds Max uses the x-axis for left and right, the y-axis for forwards and backwards, and the z-axis for up and down. Now, oddly enough, if we press F for the front view, what you'll see is that the y-axis actually points out of the back. So you go to perspective just to illustrate this a bit more clearly. So we can see that our world x-axis points to the right. If we go to the front, our x-axis is still pointing to the right, so the negative y is actually the world forward in 3DS, which is a bit confusing. But basically, as long as whatever is on this side of the model, the negative y, is the front, then we're good to go. Okay, so we've got the model in. We should probably have our line mode on so we can see what's going on. So I'm just going to press F4 on the keyboard. Alternatively, you can go to this menu here and just make sure you've got edge faces on. The first thing I want to do before I start kind of manipulating stuff is just having a look at the rough size of things. So if I go to the modify panel with this box selected, I can see that the length, which is the depth on this one, was set to 40-ish centimeters. I think it could probably do with being a bit wider than that. So I'm going to set this to 60. The width is the side to side, so I'm also going to set this to 60, so we've got a bit more of a box shape. And the height, at the minute, I'm not going to worry too much about because we're going to be manipulating this anyway. Let's rename this. So this is going to be our arcade machine, which I can spell correctly. There we go. And for scale, we're just going to go back into our create tool and just create another box, which we'll use as our scale measurement. So the length of this one, we'll make it 30 by 30, and the height will make 178. So this is our human scale reference, so we'll have to kind of bear this in mind as we kind of work and go forwards. So I'm just going to rename that object to our scale reference, and we'll just hide it for now. We'll come back to it later on. So let's start manipulating this object. So at the minute, our box is seen by 3DS as being a box. So it means that we can have parametric control over this box. We can change the length, height, width, all that sort of stuff. But we can't jump into the polygons or vertices or edges to actually manipulate the object. We have to convert it into an editable polygon object first. So a couple of ways of doing this. You can either right click on here and make an editable poly. You can right click on this object and go to convert to editable poly. We're going to just do this here, convert to editable poly. When we convert it, you'll see that we now have access to our vertices, edges, faces, all that sort of stuff. We've lost the ability to work on this object parametrically. We don't have a length and width and height, but that's fine. We can now manipulate this object any way we want. So I'm going to use vertex mode and polygon mode probably the most. It's quite rare that I use any of the other inputs or selection types, but if we need to use them, we'll get to them. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to raise up the height a little bit, because obviously this is quite small compared to my scale reference. I'm going to say on the scale reference, let's just put in some indicators where the waist is and stuff is going to be. So I've got this scale reference set to an editable poly as well. I'm just going to use the Swift Loop tool, which we can use to add in edge loops. So when you hover over the top of the object, you'll see that we get an indicator as to where this is going to go. I'd say the hips is probably going to be about roughly here, and we might as well say, okay, that's going to be where the bottom of the head is, and our shoulders and our knees, just so that we've got a couple of indicators about where things are going to go. So we'll probably want to make sure that this part here is at least up to the waist height. So let's go back to that object. So I'm going to select W to select back to the arcade machine, and we're going to go into vertex mode for this. So the first thing I want to do is just click and drag to select the points on the top to move them. And one thing that's important about selection inside of 3ds Max is that it does not operate by default what we call back-facing or back-face culling. What that means basically is if you kind of click and drag to select over a point, even if you can't see it, it will still select it on the other side. So it's very important that you're being very careful about how you select stuff. If that really irritates you and you don't want to do that, you can always turn off ignore backfacing, which will ignore any backfacing points and will allow you to select them. You can only select what you can see. But being able to select backface points does have its benefits as well. If we look from the side view, if we click on one point like this, we're only moving the point that we can see. If we click and drag over everything, we can move and select everything. So we're going to leave ignore backfacing turned off so that I can select all points. I'm going to raise this up to about the waist height. I'm going to leave it there because we're going to have this part here where the keyboard kind of juts out a little bit, and we'll want to try and get that in our model as well. So let's just go back to perspective mode. We're going to go back to our ribbon at the top, and we're going to use our Swift Loop tool just to add a couple more cuts. Now, we're going to have probably a cut which goes kind of height ways up this way around the middle, so that we can have a part to extrude the top part of the screen out, and we'll have some leftover areas to bring out where the joypad is. So I think what I'm going to do is put a height ways cut probably about here, and I'm going to put another cut probably about here as well. And the reason we're putting this one is that we want to keep the volume preservation of this section down here. When I pull this point out, I don't want to kind of pull out the entire edge. I want to keep this edge where it is and then move this one out slightly. So that's why I've got this extra cut in here. So let's grab these 2 points here. These are going to be for where the front of the keyboard is, with the joypads and stuff. We're going to just pull this out and down slightly. And we might even be able to just grab these and pull these back a little bit. There we go. So that's going to be for the first part. Cool. So far, just using Swift Loop and the movement of vertices, we can start to block in our shape. But that will only get us so far. The next part is to look at some tools which will generate new geometry. So for that, we're going to be using the extrusion tool, and we're going to be doing that inside of polygon mode. So I'm just going to maximize out the screen for a second. Don't need to keep looking at my reference all the time. And let's have a look at how the extrude tool works. So if we go to polygon mode, we can now select the different faces on our object. Our ribbon along the top here, if this isn't visible for you, so sometimes it might be hidden like this, you just want to press this little white button here, and that's going to open up the ribbon so that you can see all of your tools. There we go. So on the ribbon, most of the tools remain the same. The part that changes is this section here. So at the minute, it's set to polygon tools. If I go back to vertices, it'll be back to vertices tools, or vertex tools. If we go into edge mode, you'll see it'll have edge mode, etc, etc. So we're just going to go back into polygon mode, and I'm going to have a look at the specific polygon tools. Now, in your tool set in 3ds, anywhere where there's a small white arrow means that you can access additional tools for additional settings for that tool. So for the extrude tool, we can just click on extrude and then click and drag to create our extrusions. But if we click on the little drop down and go to the extrude settings, we can actually get this little floating menu, which you can just use your left mouse button to click and drag and move around. And we now have a sort of interactive sort of preview of what's going to happen with our tool settings. So we want to make sure I can see my scale reference here. I'm just going to basically lift this up to the top, and let's have a look. Yeah, so probably about that much. And I'm going to press the tick just to apply that setting. And for the top part where this extrudes out a little bit more, I want to kind of extrude it up another section and then extrude it out again. So let's just go back to the extrude tool. On the extrusion tool, and with many other tools, you see that you get these 3 buttons along the bottom. Now, before I just press the tick basically applies the operation but then closes the tool. If you've got multiple things to extrude one after the other, you can basically select and then press the plus to apply, but leave the tool open so that you can select the next part to be applied. So I'm going to select that part there. I'm just going to press the tick, and we've got that bit extruded. Now, I think in terms of my measurements, it is probably looking maybe a little bit too small. So I think at this point, I'm just going to go to my vertex tools. I'm just going to isolate the selection so I can see my object. And let's just go to the front view. I'm going to start by selecting all points and maybe just pulling these out a little bit. And then I'm just going to select the top parts and just move this up slightly so that if we go back into perspective and have a look at this with our scale reference, that's probably just the keyboard section that needs to come down a little bit, maybe like that. There we go. So we want to make sure that it's bigger than the player, or bigger than the character, but that it kind of observes kind of real world scale. So that's looking pretty good so far, but it's still very blocky. We want to make sure that we add a couple of additional sort of details to make it look the way it's supposed to look. One of the things that we could do is give it a bit of a tilted screen, obviously for sort of user comfort. You probably want to have the screen a bit tilted. And then we'll have a look about getting this sort of edging which goes all the way around. We'll have a look at kind of building that in as well. So let's go to the side view. And let's start by just selecting points and kind of moving things around a bit. So I think we'll start by just rotating this part around a little bit first. There we go. Maybe just pull this part in a little bit. There we go. And just move this bit in for the screen. Maybe just kind of pull that back like that. So that looks a little bit better for shape. Let's just go back to perspective view. Yeah, that looks alright for the shape. Okay, so I mentioned about these sort of beveled areas. These beveled areas here. We want to make sure that we get those in. So a nice tool to use for this is probably going to be the Swift Loop tool. And to make sure that we get it the same on both sides, we're going to cut the model in half first and apply operations to one side, but then use a modifier to flip it to the other side. So firstly, I want to put my cut down the middle, and I want to try and get it as close as possible to the middle. If you don't get it right there, that's not a problem. If you just press W to go into your points mode, just make sure the center line is set to 0 on the X, and just to sort of as a belt and braces approach, if you have a look at the align tools up here, just press align X to make sure all the center points are aligned as well. And we're just going to grab one half of the model and we're just going to press delete. So we want to keep the center line, because if we don't have that center line, there's no way to keep the model intact, but we can get away with one half of the model. Okay, so let's go to the modifier list and let's search for a symmetry modifier. Now, because I deleted the right hand side of the machine, or the left hand side of the machine as I'm looking at it, and kept the right hand side, the symmetry has worked automatically. It flips positive X over onto negative X. If we did done it the other way around, you can use in the parameters for the symmetry, you can tell it to flip your mirror axis across so that you get basically the result that you want. But the way that I've modeled this so far, it's kind of exactly how I want. Now, as soon as we go back onto Edible Poly to start re-editing this, you'll see that your symmetry goes away, and that's because 3ds Max's stack works from the top down. So if you work on a symmetry object which is higher up than the Editable Poly, if you go back down to the Editable Poly, it will ignore anything above it. Now, we can get around this. At the bottom of the modifier list, you'll see you've got this little icon here. It kind of looks like a switch. If we click on this one, you'll see that the symmetry will be applied. It's going to look up to the top of the stack and apply everything, irrespective of where in the stack you have selected. So what that does is it says the white side, the white line side, is your generated side, and the orange side with the blue dots for your vertices is the modifiable side. So if I select a point here and move it, you can see that it does it on the other side, which is perfect for our needs. So we're going to go back to the Swift Loop tool, and we're going to add another cut around the edges there. And I'm going to go now into polygon mode, and I'm going to select the loop all the way around. So there's a couple of ways I could do this. I could select one at a time and hold down Control and add, but an easier way would be just to select one and then hold down the Shift key on your keyboard to click the next topologically connected poly, and it will select the loop all the way around, which is great. That just saves us a couple of seconds, which is important when we're doing modeling and working to deadlines and stuff. So we've got that selection there. We're going to use the extrude tool again. This time we need to make sure that we're not extruding all sides. We don't need these ones on the bottom here. So I'm just going to hold Alt and click to remove those from the selection. And then we're going to go back to the extrude tool and the extrude settings. Now you can see when we've done that, it's not really extruding the way that we were expecting to. That's because in the extrude operation, there's actually 3 different ways we can extrude. We can extrude by group, which it's currently doing. We can extrude by polygon, which will extrude outwards but not keep the edges topologically connected. Or we can extrude by local normal. So extruding by local normal looks kind of like the result that we want. We've got the topologically connected edges and vertices, but everything is being extruded in the correct direction. At the minute, it's just a little bit too much of an extrusion, so we can use the polygon tool just to bring this right back down. Cool. We're happy with that. We can just press the tick to apply the extrusion, and the bulk of the machine is pretty much done. So a couple of other things we'll want to do. We'll want to have a look at getting the buttons in. If I have a look at our reference, we've got some buttons and we've got our little joysticks as well. So let's have a look at getting those details in, along with the screen itself. So the screen isn't just slapped on the top of here, it has its own set of topology that it needs to observe as well. So to do this, we're going to use a inset operation to just kind of create a smaller square mapped to the inside of this area here. Now if we do it as the model is at the minute and use the inset tool, you'll see that it's going to inset just this selection, so it's not actually observing this part here, which is, it's not going to work correctly. So what we'll need to do before we do the inset is we're going to flatten down our symmetry so that we are resulting with one object again. Now flattening down your symmetry inside of 3ds is not the same as flattening in Photoshop. We can always recut it back in half, reapply stuff. For now it's just so that we can kind of use the tools the way that we want to use them. So to flatten an object that is currently in symmetry, in your modify panel, just right click on the top of symmetry and just say collapse all. It's going to say that this is going to remove everything in the stack. Are you sure that you want to proceed? We're just going to say yes, because we want to result with the final editable poly again. So now we can go back into our polygon tool and we can select both of these and use our inset tool to get our inset screen the way that we wanted it. So we're going to inset like this, inset just a little bit so we've got a bit of a bevel around the sides of the screen, press the tick to confirm, and then just to kind of shrink the screen up a little bit, we're going to go into vertex mode, and we're going to select those 4 polys, those 4 vertices, and then we're going to scale, not by uniform, actually let's grab these 3 and let's just press W for move, and let's just go to our coordinate settings and set this to local. Is local going to be the right one? No, not local. Let's have a look. Do we want to constrain to face? Let's try constrain to face and see what happens here. Yes, that's what we want. So if we constrain to face and move this up, it will allow us to keep this section here coplanar. There we go. So we just want to make sure we've got enough space for the screen. With the constraint to face, we can move things around to make sure that they are constrained fully. Let's have a look. Might be easier in vertex mode to do this, just to move that screen down a little bit. There we go. Excellent. Okay, now we've got that area selected, we can now apply our inner extrusion to get some depth into the screen. So we're going to use the extrude tool again. This time, rather than a positive extrusion, we're going to use a slight negative extrusion just to get some depth into the screen. Cool, so that's looking pretty good. Let's have a look at how we might get some slightly rounder corners and some rounder edges before we move on to creating some other objects. So we're going to go into edge mode for this. We're going to select the edges here. And we'll select the edges here. There we go. So for this one, we're going to use the chamfer tool. What the chamfer tool does is it allows you to basically kind of plane away and cut off a corner to make it slightly more round. So we're using, as we did before with the extrusion tool, we're not just applying the chamfer directly, we're going to go into the settings to grab our preview before we apply our operation. So a couple of things to bear in mind here is that we have different types of extrusion. We've got standard, different types of chamfer. We've got standard chamfer and we've got quad chamfer. Quad chamfer allows you to get an element of tension on your chamfer operation. So you might want to have slightly rounded extrusion, slightly slightly rounded chamfers, which will give you a nice look like that. You can change the tension, you can change the size of the chamfer, but be careful you don't push it too much, otherwise you'll get intersecting and overlapping geometry. So just got to be a little bit careful with how you apply it, not too much, just enough to get that rounded shape. Okay, I'm happy with that. I'm going to press tick to confirm that, and that is pretty much the arcade machine itself finished. So let's have a look at our reference image. Here we go. So we're going to need a series of buttons, so 8 buttons per side, and then have a look at doing our joystick as well. So let's just minimize this now again, and let's have a look at how we would work on these objects. So I'm going to start by just creating another new object. Let's create a cylinder. We'll use this for the button. So we're just going to create a new one, and let's have a look in the settings for this. We don't need to have 18 sides, we could probably get away with 8 just to keep this nice and low poly. And in terms of the height segments, let's just start with 2 for now. So we're going to position this up first to where it needs to go. And let's go to the side view and just make sure that this is fully lined up with what we're expecting. So I have got my angle snap on at the minute. You may want to just turn off your angle snap so you can rotate this unconstrained. I want to make sure that it's lined up nicely with this edge here. There we go. Excellent. Okay. So let's right click, convert this to an edible poly, and I'm going to just select polygon mode, and select around the sides here, and I'm just going to start by extruding this out by the local normal, just so that I've got a little bit of a sort of a little bevel pad around the sides of the button. I'm going to press tick, and I'm going to select the top face and just set my coordinate system to local, just so I can pull this up slightly along the local normal. And if we have a look at our reference, we might have a slight bit of an indent in the button. So we're going to use our inset tool just to inset that in slightly. Not so much, probably about that much there. Let's just inset that first and lift that up, and then inset again, just so that we've got a smaller part. Confirm that one, and then just recess that in. Great, so we've got our buttons. We'll now just need to create some duplicates of this and then line them up nicely. So let's go to the top view so that we can see our buttons. We're going to press Ctrl V, and we want to create these as copies. So don't worry too much about the name just yet. We'll go through and we'll rename things. So I'm just going to use my X and Y tool just to kind of pull these over. Let's have a look at the placement on the machine. So they're kind of at angles. Might need to have a look at another reference image. Here we go. So something like this maybe, or we could just keep them nice and straight. It's really up to you. It's your arcade machine that you're building. So I think the majority of these are kind of at slight angles. So we'll keep that in terms of our model as well. So I'm just going to move this slightly down. Control V again, and just move this slightly down. And we'll repeat that process again. Select those three and Control V. And we may need to just go to the side view for this, but we'll want to move these up. There we go. And each of our objects, we'll just make sure that we position these down as well, so that they're in a line. Cool. Okay, let's have a look in perspective. So there we go, we've got all of our buttons lined up nicely. We'll have a look back at our reference image. Could probably do with the buttons being slightly closer. Let's jump back into 3DS. Select those three. Just going to move them down, just trying to make sure that they're still lined up with this line here. And there we go. Cool, so let's just grab all of those buttons and Control V just to copy those across. And we'll put them on the other side of the machine. Maybe put these a little bit further over. Excellent. So let's have a look now at the joystick. So we'll try and keep this nice and easy. We'll probably just want to have a sphere with an extrusion down the bottom. So we'll want to go and create another new object. Let's just go and grab a sphere. Here we go. Load this up. Let's just move this up into position first, and then we can have a look at getting the size right. So I think maybe just a touch smaller. Maybe 2 centimeters, maybe 1.5, so that gives us a 3 centimeter radius, which I think is pretty realistic. And again, we can turn down the sides. Let's just set this to something like 12. And let's right click and convert this to an edible poly. So I'm just going to press on the isolate tool again, just a couple of times, just so that we're isolating this. We'll want to do that just so that we're not being distracted by the other objects. Once we're happy, we can convert this to an edible poly. And I'm just going to start by adding in a swift loop. And you'll see that the swift loop, when we try and add it to this section down here, it's not going to apply. And the reason for this is because this section up here is comprised of what we call quads or quadrilaterals, 4-sided polygons. This sort of section at the bottom where we get the pole of the sphere is comprised of triangles. And triangles, it's not so easy to kind of cut them in half. or use things like the Swift Loop tool because the topology doesn't allow it. So I think what we'll actually do is, rather than use the Swift Loop tool, we'll select the bottom face. To make sure we don't move it. And we'll use the inset tool, just so that we can inset this slightly. There we go. So, once we're happy, we can tick this down. And this bottom face, I just want to flatten it by using the Align Z tool. And what that's going to do is going to flatten out that perfectly on the bottom, which will make extruding out the sort of the stem of the joystick a lot easier. So with that done, we can now go to extrude, use the extrude settings. I don't want to extrude it too far. Let's just unisolate this so we can get a bit of a better idea about how far it needs to go down. I'd probably say about a couple of centimeters. There we go. Once I'm happy, just tick. And we can now use our Swift Loop tool just to add another cut around here. I'm going to do this so that I can select around the bottom and just extrude out my base, kind of similar to these. Again, just make sure we're using local normal. So not too much, probably about there. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. So tick that one to confirm that. And as we did before, we can use our left side view just to get this rotated to the angle that we want. So because the rotation is here, it might be difficult to kind of get things rotated the way we want. We can use the Align tool to align the rotation of this object to match the rotation of another object. So we could say match the X rotation of this object to the X rotation of this object. So let's select this one. And we're going to go to the Align tool up the top here. And I'm going to click on this one. And we don't want to align the positions, so we can untick the positions. We do want to align the X rotation. So you want to align the X rotation. Just press Apply. Oops, sorry, the Y rotation. Let's get my axes correct. And press OK. And that has now rotated it perfectly to match the other one. Have a look from the left view. There we go. So you can see that's perfectly aligned now. And if we set this to local, we can now just move it and rotate it the way that we want. Okay, let's just hide our scale reference. There we go. So if we can get this positioned roughly the way we want. Okay, so we could perhaps maybe make this slightly bigger. I'm just going to select these points at the top here. Let's just scale them locally. Maybe not too big, just a little bit. Make sure we're using local mode. Oh. Parent. There we go, just so we can move that up. And we can select the bottom verts and just do the same. Just scale them up. There we go. That's great. So we can go back into object mode for that. Let's just press Ctrl V to create a copy, and then we can move this over to the other side. Cool. Okay, so we've got our arcade machine set up nicely with all the objects. Let's just do a little bit of housekeeping, get everything tidied up. So we can just grab all of these cylinders. I'm just going to go to Tools and use the Rename Objects tool. Just untick base name and just tick to remove the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Remove the first 8 digits first to get rid of the word cylinder, and then prefix with buttons. For the sphere, let's remove the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Let's just remove all digits. Oh, can't do that. Let's just remove 8 for now. And let's just call this one joystick. Rename. And let's apply the same thing for the other one. Rename the first digits and apply joystick. Perfect. So we've got everything modeled nicely. We've got it modeled to scale. So that concludes the first video on getting everything modeled. In the next video, we'll have a look at applying the UVs to each object. We'll have a look at how we can kind of take some shortcuts and use different projection types to apply the UV coordinates for these objects.